U11L4. Olaudah, Equiano reading. Olaudah Equiano recalls the middle passage, 1789. Directions. Read the introduction paragraph in the passage below and answer the multiple choice questions in the boxes as you read the passage. Highlight the multiple choice answers you think is correct. After you're done reading the passage, complete the questions below the reading. Introduction. Olaudah Equiano, 1745 to 1797, also known as Gustavus Vasa, was born in Benin in West Africa. When he was about 10 years old, he was kidnapped by Africans known as Aros and sold into slavery. After being sold multiple times, he was purchased by Europeans who shipped him to Barbados and then to Virginia. Ultimately, Equiano gained his freedom, moved to England, became a Christian missionary and abolitionist, and wrote his life story. In the excerpt below, he recounted his experience of the brutal Middle Passage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Until recently, most historians trusted Equiano's autobiography. However, in Equiano, the African biography of a self-made man, Vincent Carretta presents evidence that suggests that Equiano was probably born in South Carolina, although this possibility certainly undermines one's confidence in the truthfulness of Equiano's narrative. It seems likely that he drew on stories that he had heard of in the Middle Passage, if indeed he did not experience it firsthand. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were to sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair and their language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment that, if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them all to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country. Question 1. What was Equiano scared that the white men would do to him? A. Kill him. B. Drown him. C. Leave him at the port. When I looked round the ship too, I saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of the countenances expressing dejection and sorrow. I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I felt motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people around me, who I believed were some of those who brought me on board, and had been receiving their pay. They talked to me in order to cheer me, but all in vain. I asked them if they were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. They told me I was not. Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off, and left me abandoned to despair. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore, which I now consider as friendly, and I even wish for my former slavery in preference to the present situation, which was filled with horrors of every kind, still heightened by my ignorance of what I was to undergo. I was not long suffered to indulge my grief. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation smell in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with a loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. Question 2. What happened to Equiano below the ship's desk? A. He saw a woman giving birth with no one to help. B. He found a box full of food and shared it with his fellow Africans on the ship. C. He found the below deck was very smelly, so much so that he didn't want to eat. I now wish for the last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me edibles, food, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass, which is a flat bar in a ship usually used as part of the sail, and tied my feet, while the other hit me severely. Question 3. What did the slave traders do to Equiano when he refused to eat? A. They tied Equiano down and hit him. B. They threatened to throw Equiano overboard. C. They gave Equiano fresh water. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feel the element the first time I saw it. Yet, nevertheless, could I have not got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who are not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. This indeed was often the case with myself. What did some Africans do to try to escape? Why doesn't this work well? A. They tried to use their chains as a weapon to threaten the crew and take over the ship, but the ship's crew was armed with weapons. B. They tried to build their own raft out of barrels and leftover rope, but the ocean was too rough to use the raft on. C. They tried to jump overboard, but there are nets on the boat to catch them, and the guards would beat up anyone who tried. In a little time after, amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation, which in a small degree gave ease to my mind. I inquired of these what was to be done with us. They gave me to understand we were to be carried to those white people's country to work for them. I then was a little revived, and thought if it were no worse than working, my situation was not so desperate. But still, I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty, and this not only shown towards us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. I could not help expressing my fears and apprehensions to some of my countrymen. I asked them if these people had no country, but lived in this hollow place, the ship. They told me they did not, but came from a distant one. Then, said I, how come it in all our country we never heard of them? They told me because they lived so very far off. I then asked, where were the women? And they any like themselves? I was told that they had. And why, said I, do we not see them? They answered, because they were left behind. I asked how the vessel could go. They told me they could not tell, but that they were cloths put upon the mast by the help of the ropes I saw. And then the vessel went on, and the white men had some spell or magic that they put in the water. Then they liked in order to stop the vessel. I was exceedingly amazed at this account, and really thought they were spirits. I therefore wished much to be from amongst them, for I expected they would sacrifice me. But my wishes were vain, for we were so quartered that it was impossible for any of us to make our escape. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had to be permitted to stay on the deck for fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo was combined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspiration, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victim to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wrenched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell, were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Happily, perhaps, for myself, I was soon reduced so low here that it was thought necessary to keep me almost always on deck, and from my extreme youth I was not put in fetters, chains. Question 5. What were the living conditions like for the Africans on the boat? A. The living conditions were very cold. They were given thin cotton blankets, but it didn't do much to keep out the cold. B. The living conditions were hot, humid, filthy, and cramped. Illness spread quickly on the boat. C. The living conditions were very dry. None of the sea water would get below deck, so the air was very dry. One day, when we had a smooth sea and moderate wind, 2 of my wearied countrymen, who were chained together, I was near them at the time, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the netting and jumped into the sea. Immediately another quiet, dejected fellow, who, on account of his illness, was suffered to be out of irons, also followed their example, and I believe many more would very soon have done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. Those of us that were the most active were in a moment put down under the deck, and there was such a noise and confusion amongst the people of the ship as I had never heard before, to stop her and get the boat out to go after the slaves. However, 2 of the wretches were drowned, but they got to the other and afterwards flogged him unmercifully for thus attempting to prefer death to slavery. Question 6. What happened to the Africans who jumped over the ship? A. 2 of them died by drowning. The one survivor was beaten. B. All of them died by drowning. Their crew did not want to save them from the ocean. C. 2 of them were rescued and punished by not being given any food. In this manner, we continue to undergo more hardships that I can now relate, hardships which are inseparable for this accursed trade. Many a time we were near suffocation from the want of fresh air, which we were often without for whole days together. This and the stench of the necessary tubs carried off many. At last we came in sight of the island of Barbados, at which the whites on board gave a great shout and made many signs of joy to us. We did not know what to think of this, but as the vessel drew nearer, we plainly saw the harbor and other ships of different kinds and sizes, and we soon anchored amongst them off Bridgetown, which is a city in Barbados in the Caribbean. Many merchants and planters now came on board. Though it was in the evening, they put us in separate parcels and examined us attentively. They also made us jump and point to the land, signifying we were to go there. We thought by this we should be eaten by these ugly men, as they appeared to us, and when, soon after, we were all put down on the deck again, there was much dread and trembling among us, and nothing but bitter cries to be heard all the night from these apprehensions, insomuch that at last the white people got some old slaves from the land to pacify us. They told us we were not to be eaten, but to work, and were soon to go on land, where we should see many of our country people. This report eased us much, and sure enough, soon after we landed, there came to us Africans of all languages. We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together, like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age. Question 7. What happened to Equiano and other Africans when they reached Barbados? A. They were lined up so a doctor could check them for any illness. Half of them were brought onto another boat to sail to Brazil. B. They were sold directly to the plantation owners as soon as they stepped off the boat. The plantation owners would immediately bring them to the sugarcane fields. C. They were grouped together and told to jump. Then they were pent up together like sheep when they arrived at the merchant's yard. We were not many days in the merchant's custody before we were sold after their usual manner, which is this. On a signal given at the beat of a drum, the buyers rushed at once into the yard where the slaves are confined, and make choice of that parcel they liked best. The noise and clamor with which this is attended, and the eagerness visible of the countenances of the buyers, serve not a little to increase the apprehension of the terrified Africans, who may well be supposed to consider them as the ministers of the destruction of which they think themselves devoted. In this manner, without scruple, our relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. Below are 3 questions about the text. Answer the questions. 1. Who created this source? What do we know about this person? Hint, back in the introduction paragraph. 2. Why is this kind of text important to read today? 3. Summarize this text in 2 bullet points or 2 complete sentences. Make sure you answered all the questions, then you can turn it in, and then go on to watch U11 L5 Edpuzzle and answer the questions directly on the Edpuzzle.